the subject matter, it's kind of heavy. It's kind of hard to really get your head around anyway, and it's even more difficult to try to communicate and speak on it. So I'll just let you know that, because like I was telling a couple of guys earlier, I was like, we're going to leave. I don't think we'll have any answers, but we'll have a lot of perspective, because it's one of those subjects that I don't think you can really answer. And it's how can a God of love allow so much pain and suffering in the world and in our lives? How can he allow such evil to take place if he's this God who really loves us? And he is. How can that happen? And so we're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about it in two parts and see what God does. So it's interesting how whenever there's a huge catastrophe along the lines of a 9/11 or the tsunami that hit a few years ago, or even this week, there's been multiple earthquakes and just taking of lives around the world. And it's interesting how so often in those moments there's this outcry against God. How could God allow that? How could God just allow 50 innocent people just to die because an earthquake happened and a building fell? Those were people's moms and dads and daughters and sons. And and there's this outcry against how could God do that? Yet, the amount of people who suffer and die on a daily basis far surpasses the number that will lose or suffer in a single event. But most people, myself included, we're too busy to really notice all the pain and suffering and much less to question God on these. But when the big stuff happens, suddenly there's this outcry. In many cases though, especially if it's our enemy or someone we don't like, or someone who has hurt someone that we love, when evil or pain or suffering happens to them, we don't have a problem with that, right? We're like, yeah, they got what they deserved, right? Yeah, we're okay with it. Isn't that funny? It's like, how could God be love, pain, and suffering? Oh, I'm so glad that happened to them. They're such jerks, And then even if it's somebody we really don't like, we almost like, that's a good one right there, God. Yeah. I knew you felt the same way I did about that jerk. Yeah. Well, it's equally intriguing to me, though, that those who have no regard for God in their lives whatsoever, they don't worship, they don't pray, at all, they're usually the ones who are the first to lash out about how could God do this? And if there's a God, it's like, you don't even believe in him. Well, what are you lashing out about, So how can that happen? The problem for many is instead of seeking the purpose in pain and suffering, they attack the person of God. It's this shift. One of the reasons behind our lack of willingness to seek a greater purpose for our end suffering is because we 21st century Americans, we wrestle with the possibility of there being some collective good that could come out of pain and suffering. Andrew Delbanco reveals this thinking when he wrote, something in the later 20th century, something dies. Namely, any conception of a common destiny worth tears and sacrifice and maybe even death. The contemporary person, for example, does not feel much guilt because he or she no longer feels there exists something in the world that transcends himself. So as he and many other great thinkers and writers have pointed out, and this was interesting to me in my research, every generation in the history of the world, every generation and every culture in history has understood pain and suffering as a part of life and a means to a greater good. We're the first generation in history that's wrestled with it. Every other generation just knew as part of life. You live, You have good days, you have bad days. There's suffering on some days, there's not suffering on others. There's more suffering going on, and it's part of life, and it all weaves in to the story and to this thing called life. I mean, it's really only in recent years that we find that a generation that views any suffering as an inconvenience to the perfect, pain-free world that we are desperately trying to create for ourselves and our families. Because life has been and forever will be filled with both just and unjust suffering. It's always been that way. There's always been victims and innocent victims. It's a part of life. It's part of being in a world where God loved us enough to give us free will to make choices. Another author put it this way: instead of trying to shape our desires to fit reality, we now seek to control and shape reality to fit our desires. Because usually when we really are wrestling with something, what we say is this: I saw that differently in my head, right? Than this. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. Who's the center of that? We are. That doesn't fit into my picture. You know, I want us to really ask ourselves another question. Do we really want Jesus? Do we really want God to rid the world of all evil and pain and suffering? I mean, is that really what we want? Where he just snaps his fingers and removes everyone on the planet who with hate and prejudice in their hearts. It's like, oh. Do we want him to take away the people who would find out that their child would have a physical defect and they allow that child to be born anyway, that God remove them because that's going to bring suffering in the world? So we're going to remove anyone who would allow a child. So God remove them. Or God, if someone's going to give birth to a child that will one day grow up and do something filled with hate and rage, God, just remove those parents. Take them off the planet because we don't want that to happen. If you love us, you wouldn't let that person be born. You say, okay, Jeff, my gosh, you're so dramatic. Let's look at it this way, Jeff. How about God just remove all the murderers? Ha! Can we agree on that one? God, remove the evil murderers. Okay, well, I got to clarify that though, okay? Are we talking about those who kill life instantly, or the murderers who kill slowly the dreams and the hearts and the self-esteem of others? Let's think about it another way. To say that there can't be a God of love because we see such pain and suffering is like saying that there can't be good because evil is present. Yet we witness good and evil every day. A matter of fact, how do we know something is good? Unless we've experienced what? Evil, something bad. How do we know we're happy unless we have tasted sadness? How can we know what love really is unless we've experienced hate? They have to coexist. How do we know there's light without darkness. Wouldn't we all also agree that none of us wants to suffer? I mean, come on. Or that we even come close to fully understanding a God of love in a world with tragedy and suffering. Yet, even though we wouldn't want that, and even though we don't fully understand it, we have to agree that we have all seen where good comes from a bad situation. Because we will say what? Hindsight is 2020. And you look back and go, my gosh, if I'd have known this, I wouldn't have been so upset then. Because so much good has come from this. I'd have never in a million years thought that at that moment. So that even with our finite mind's ability to see that there is some purpose in suffering, if we can see that, okay, if we as humans with a finite mind can see that, then surely with an infinite God, that he can have purpose in suffering that we are unable to comprehend. I'm not completely sure, I'm just being very honest, how the perfect plan of God and the free will of humans to make choices where pain and suffering and evil and good and the sincere prayers of his people, I don't know fully how all that works together. I don't even come close to getting it. But I'm unclear where or how the sovereignty of God and the sinfulness of humanity intersects. I don't know where all that intersects. But I do know in the middle of it, though, at least for me, there stands a cross. At the intersection of my confusion and my lack of fully understanding how love and perfect will of God, my ability to choose and all that, where it all swirls around with your 50,000 questions. For me, in the middle of it, there's this cross where for those of us that are Christians, where Jesus paid the ultimate price of pain and suffering in order to redeem us from eternal punishment for sin. And for those, and we all have done evil. We all have done hurtful things. We've all spoken words that speak death into people's life. And we spoke life, we spoke death, we've done good, we've done bad. We're all those people. So in Christ, he's offered us that we could live with hope. That when this life is over, that's filled with good and bad, pain and suffering, that there's this, in the midst of this, there's this hope that we can live with, that on one day that all that is wrong will be made right, and the evil will receive what they deserve, and the righteous their reward, and we will be reunited with the loved ones that our hearts yearn to see again and to hold them and kiss them one more time. We'll be reunited. And as 1 Corinthians 13:12 says, what we know in part, in that moment we will know in full. I heard it said once, and I believe this, that the first word that will be spoken by every person when you step into heaven will be, yeah, okay, yeah. But until that day, if we will love and trust God over our feelings and people's opinions, then God's love will transform our pain to purpose. Romans 8:28, a very familiar passage for those that grew up in church world. It says, and we know that in how many things? All things. Did another Greek word study. Guess what all means? All. Y'all are smart. Y'all are geniuses. Nothing greater than speaking to a smart crowd. We know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him and who have been called according to his purpose. What is that purpose? To live a life of love. That you receive this love and you live a life giving it to everyone you come into contact with. So in that, he will take even the hate and the venomous words of others, and he will work it into something good, because that's what God does. He doesn't stop free will, but he will take a poor choice, in some way bring purpose to that in our lives. Here's one of my Jeff-isms. It is a weak God who is not sovereign, and it would be a sick God who has no purpose in suffering and no salvation from sin. And I'm going to go ahead and say this. Even if the suffering is found in doing what's right. Because see, sometimes we go, I get it if that person's a jerk, they should suffer. But that person didn't do anything wrong, or they're good. They did what's right. 1 Peter 4, verse 12. Dear friends, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come on you to test you as though something strange were happening to you. In other words, what do we say? I don't understand how this happened. I mean, why me? What did I do to deserve this? But rejoice in as much as you participate in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted because of the name of Christ, because of love, being good in love, that's the name Christ. You know what I'm saying? When you think name of Christ, you got to think, who is he? He's love. He's a God of love that loves everybody, regardless of the color of your skin or your sexual preferences or the mistakes that you've made. Or he's like, listen, he loves us. So it said, don't be surprised when you're attacked for loving people that other people don't love. Don't be surprised if you're gay and you embrace people that are straight. And if you're straight, you embrace gays. If you're black, you embrace whites. And he said, don't be surprised when you start loving people, you're going to start seeing how much hate there really is in the world. He said, so don't be surprised. I mean, you know what the word Christian means in its original language? Seriously. It means little Christ. In other words, in the book of Acts, it's the first time the word Christian was ever used. And what happened was after the disciples all received the Holy Spirit and Christ had died and resurrected and returned to the Father, they were watching how they loved everybody. And they went, look at those little Jesuses. Look at those little Christs. Meaning they act just like he did. They love everybody. What is that all about? What a horrible reputation, huh? Think about it. We get most upset for being persecuted or suffering over doing what's right. Think about it. Let that soak in for a minute, because we're all guilty of it. It's like we're about to have this angel of duh fly over, so I'm just letting you know. Wouldn't you rather suffer for loving people than suffer because you're a hateful person? But yet we wrestle when we suffer for being a good person. Here it comes. Duh. Wow. Never thought of it that way. Oh my gosh. OMG. SMH. For those who don't know, I'm shaking my head. I just learned that about 2 months ago myself. So I asked my son, I said, why do people in an SMH? What the heck's that mean? He goes, what I'm doing right now because you don't know. Shaking my head. I was like, oh, punk teenager, you're a punk. But we can trust God even in our pain. Even in our pain, we can. What many fail to understand is how pain can be a gift from God. Now, before you get angry about that and go, oh, that's enough, I'm out of here, freak. Let me finish with this, all right? I'm convinced, if given the opportunity, that people would remove all pain from life, or at least say that a loving God would. I think if we had that opportunity in our ignorance, or just our desire to be pain-free, we would remove all of it, or expect God to. So I want you to watch this short video, and then afterwards see if we all still feel the same way.
For the first 4 months of her life, Gabby was the perfect little baby. It wasn't until she started teething that her parents, Steve and Trish, noticed some odd behavior.
I was massaging Gabby's gums one day, and she bit down on me ungodly hard. And when I pulled my finger out of her mouth, I pulled the tooth out of her mouth. She's just happy playing like nothing happened.
It was as if she didn't even feel it. And that was just the beginning. The 4-month-old would teeth on anything. Plastic toys, hardcover books, even her own fingers, until they were bloody.
She damaged them so badly, it really looked like raw hamburger. It was that chewed up and mangled.
She would also chew on her tongue like it was bubble gum.
It was bizarre and frightening. Steve and Trish brought Gabby to doctor after doctor. For months, specialists tested the baby for everything, from metabolic diseases to rare genetic disorders, and ruled out one disease after another.
Trish reached the frustration point, and she sat down at the computer and basically spent the whole weekend on the internet, searching and looking, and she found some pictures of kids with fingers that looked like Gabby's, just chewed up and mutilated. So that was the first time we'd heard the term hereditary sensory autonomic neuropathy.
HSAN. It's an extremely rare genetic disorder that affects the sensory nerves. In Gabby, the nerve fibers that detect pain and temperature never developed. There is no cure.
From the moment she was born, Ashlyn Blocker didn't cry when she was hungry or had diaper rash, or even when, at just 8 months old, her parents took her to the eye doctor.
When they put the dye in her eye, everyone just kind of gasped. She had a big corneal abrasion across her eye. They were astonished she wasn't in pain.
It was then her parents got the shocking, devastating news. Their baby couldn't feel any pain.
It was scary because, there weren't very many good outcomes that were involved with this condition. People passing away from appendicitis because they didn't have the warning signs, and bone infections.
I understand that the toddler years were some of the worst, where she would continue to injure herself.
Yeah, the biting, her burning her hands, different things. Tara actually would wrap her hands up with athletic tape. She'd be our little boxer.
Photo after photo document injuries that pained her parents, but not their little girl. What is it like for you to send her out the door every day, knowing what can happen without you there to watch?
It was rough at first.
A medical mystery that for Ashlyn, now 12, I love this room.
Thank you.
I love the color. Is just a normal part of life. How would you describe to somebody like me what it feels like to not have any pain?
It's just me. It's all I ever known.
I read an article about a little girl in Georgia who has this disease. And her mother said this: people think being able to live without pain is a good thing, but no, it's not. Pain is there for a reason. It's your body's way of saying something's wrong and needs to be fixed. I would give anything for my daughter to feel pain. The pain and suffering of this world is a constant reminder, just like this lady said in her article, that something's wrong and needs to be fixed. That's where that pain comes from. Yes, this is wrong and needs to be fixed. That hate, it hurts because it's wrong and it needs to be corrected with love. That bigotry hurts because it's wrong. That racism hurts because it's wrong. It needs to be corrected with love. And the cross is our reminder that God agrees. So listen, some of the greatest stories of spiritual growth and God's faithfulness are written on the pages of our darkest moments. You just heard Cindy share that a while ago, and had our person led us in worship just shared the same thing. That today was written on the back page of 6 years of spiritual hurt for whatever reason to walk away. So here's our choice. Here's our takeaway. You ready? We can use pain and suffering as an excuse to turn from God. Or we can use it as our reason to turn to God. But I want you to be keenly aware of something. As long as there's humans on this planet and we're all breathing, there will be great days, there will be bad days. There will be good people, there will be evil people. There will be pain and suffering. Our choice is if we walk through that alone or walk through it with God's help. That's the only choice we get to make in it. Are we going to love, and are we going to walk through this life that's filled with good and bad, love and hate, with or without God in it? That's our two choices.